Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here, Amanda, and everyone else.
Yeah. Okay. Should I go ahead and sort of jump in here?
Yeah, launch it.
Okay, great. Thanks for everyone first for joining us. I think we're on the smaller side of a group, which can be great actually, because that'll allow us to have more sort of conversation and back and forth and maybe get to some more very specific question folks might have, and also ideas. So I wanted to start off by asking, first of all, how much folks are or are not familiar with the California Protected Areas Database and or the easement database. So these are two GIS databases for California that track protected lands across the state. And so if you could put in the chat if you are very familiar, somewhat, or not at all, that'll help me gauge how much we should start with that piece of background or not. All right, we have a very familiar. Okay. That sounds like folks are pretty familiar so far. Okay, so one about CPAD, but not so much CCED. They're quite complementary. I would say most of the knowledge that we'll go over today would be sort of the same between the two, just knowing that one tracks easement, one has fee lands, and they're pretty well the same, but just a little bit of attributing on things. So, and I do have a slide deck, and I pulled that up now, but I think I anticipate more of this being a dialogue, so hopefully folks are willing to either in the chat or even come off of mute if you feel comfortable. That would be great. I did get a few not familiar or not knowing much about, so what I think I'll do is just cruise through some of these first few slides and make sure that everybody has that background. So ultimately, I think what we're getting towards today, and correct me if I'm wrong, but looking at how 30 by 30 is interacting and not with freshwater tracking of lands, right? Okay, so let's back up and start with just 30 by 30, what it is and the basis of how that's all started. So jumping in, this is me. I'm Amanda Kochanek, and I work on a lot of the data. So we contract through the state. We've been doing this for years, long before 30 by 30 was ever thought of. And so what we're doing are taking data that we have and helping to use that to inform 30 by 30. So this is a little bit about GreenInfo. If you don't know, we're also a nonprofit organization, been around for, I don't know, we started in 96, a long time. I've been here over 20 years, and most of that I've been working related to what we'll be talking about today. So CPAD is the California Protected Areas Database. It's a GIS database. It's free, open source, open use, all open engagement. We encourage feedback and corrections and information as you have it. So you can download it anytime online. We release it twice a year, and we track core information about lands across California. So the owner of the land who manages the property could be the same, could be different. Is the public allowed to access the land or not? If we know the year of establishment, we do that so we can show change over time, etc. When possible, we go down to the assessor parcel geometry. So we tried to be very refined in identifying the properties. And as of right now, we're at 49.9 million. We wished we could push over to 50 in the last release. Didn't quite get there. Maybe at the end of the year. The complementary database, which you can see visually covers a lot less land, at least currently, is the easement database. It's also a free open GIS database you can grab online. We're continually updating both of these. As I said, if you see anything that looks to be missing or incorrect, we always love to hear that and make our best efforts to get that corrected. This is 2.6 million acres. We know there are a fair number of lands missing within easements. That's an area for improvement. And I will say they will always be smaller than ownership, but they are key for a lot of different biodiversity and connectivity reasons. So we do have a raised hand. Sam, if you want to come off mute.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you.
Yes.
So maybe you can just clarify for folks why the protected areas database says that approximately half of California's land is in a protected areas database, while the 30 by 30 initiative says we still need 6 million acres protected. Can you speak to that?
Yes, we
for a bit?
will. Yes,
Thank
you
you.
you are foreshadowing this perfectly
Okay,
for me.
all right,
Great.
very good.
Yes. So this here is 4.9, and then you can add in also this 2.6. So like, wait, we're already over 30. What are we talking about? But the difference is that these are foundational databases, but it is not adding the two together. And the reason for that is that CPAD and CCED, as I noted, came into existence, 20 to 25 years ago, and they were meant to be much broader. And so we are tracking things for multiple users across the state with a variety of objectives and goals. 30 by 30's objective is biodiversity, but we in CPAD, for example, also track other local recreational based parks that may be entirely paved but have play structures for students and other children. So here are some examples of the diversity of what we have in the data, and we'll go through how we get from these two databases into 30 by 30. So hopefully that'll answer your question, Sam, but stop me as we go if there are questions. So this is a pretty classic example. You would think of Lassen National Park as something that would be in a protected areas database, right? So this would probably count towards 30 by 30 also. A regional park that you might think of is likely to count towards 30 by 30. But what about, as I mentioned, a local playground or a city park or something that has highly mixed use? These are different things that are important for different objectives, but this is not going to feed into biodiversity protection in the long term. Another example of a more recent park in some of the urban areas that are more focused on community and culture versus open space biodiversity. So what we have are CPAD, CCED shown here in blue, but what you see in green are those lands that count towards 30 by 30. So you can see there are a fair number. Now, some of this we'll get into is the data is just not accurate, and we've been working to improve it. It's actually been improved since this map. I should refresh that. But we never anticipate that just because it's in CPAD or CCED, it will then count towards 30 by 30 because the lands are just too diverse in the databases. So that raises the question of like, how do you get from one to the next? How do you get to 30 by 30? So the system that the state of California has decided to use is the USGS gap code system. And that comes down to three things. One, it has to be permanently protected. So that does mean that you should qualify and need to be included in either CPAD or CCED. So if you're not in those databases, you're not going to count towards 30 by 30. That's the starting place. Then within that, we need to know that that land is actually being conserved for the purpose of biodiversity. So that's going to eliminate a lot of city parks and other types of areas in there. Also something like BLM, there'll be parts of it that count, but parts of it that don't. So just because it's BLM, that is not enough protection. There needs to be an additional designation or other information about the protection that elevates something such as BLM or Forest Service. So when you think back to that first slide where I said 49.9 million is already protected, huge numbers are going to fall out once you take out the Forest Service and BLM that don't show additional protection. So that's what pulls us back down under. And then on top of that, not only does it need to be conserved for biodiversity, it actually has to have a management plan that will sustain that into the future. So it needs to have a laid out management plan. Now, these three things are sort of nodes of what needs to happen. And then the next part is talking about how we actually apply those to the data, which is what I generally work on. So as I said, there's the gap code system. This comes out of USGS, and they're ranking entirely on the purpose of biodiversity. And after review, California has decided that those that are eligible for a GAP rank 1 or a GAP rank 2 are those that will count towards 30 by 30. So anything in the 3 and the 4 are not going to count towards 30 by 30, but they will remain in our two databases. So GAP 1 and 2 may not mean a lot to most folks on the call, so we'll talk through those a little bit now. This is a flow chart. We have a lot of information online, and this is one sort of basic key way. And I will say this helps at a conceptual level and you start to think of it, but it's certainly not going to answer all of your questions. But so the first thing, as you'll see goes back to the previous slide, is the land permanently protected? If so, yes. So you're going to carry on and you'll end up at a 1, 2, or 3. If it's not permanently protected, you're already a gap 4. So you know it's not going to count towards 30 by 30. Then the legally enforceable management plan, and then also the uses that get towards biodiversity. So there is allowing of other uses on the property, but it has to do if they are low intensity or high intensity, but small portions, such as 5% or less, I think is the threshold. So this is the general scope. Now, some people can go through this with their lands or property and land at a clear answer. Other people end up with questions within here, and then we work with USGS to find those solutions, which does raise the question then of who assigns gap codes, and that's actually the folks that manage the land. So if you own and or manage a property, that organization then has the authority to self-assign the gap code. And the reason for this is that the gap code system is developed and maintained at a national level, obviously coming out of USGS. And once you start to apply it at the local level, there's just a lot of nuance that a federal agency is not going to be able to understand or know about all of these properties. And so it was deemed that those folks that are closest to the land managing and or owning it are the ones most appropriate to assign those gap codes. So I want to stop. Do we have questions? This is a lot. We dove like straight in, so. Everybody following along so far?
This is
Okay.
great. Thank you, Amanda.
Sure, happy to. And this slide deck's available. I can always have calls, like stop me at any point.
I have a quick question.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to be
please.
late.
No worries.
Could you just expand a little more on the gap 2? Like, what types of uses are permitted?
Yeah, so
yeah, just expand on that, like what's allowed. And
there's a lot
what's
of
not.
documentation out of USGS, but I will say it's never really going to answer all of your questions. So like something like a light trail. So if you have somebody going through bird watching, general hiking, it's a small trail, there's not a lot of disturbance, that would qualify. So sometimes that'll be in a regional park, sometimes that's on Forest Service land. So there's sort of a variety. And I will say in most instances, it's sort of gray areas. And so a lot of it comes back to what is the intent. And one thing that we're also suggesting now is more and more folks are being able to fill out their gap code information, is look for similar properties to yours. And we're looking for conceptual consistency. So if you can think of another agency near you that happens to have already assigned gap codes and you feel like your lands are pretty similar, you can start to use theirs to inform. So I will show some examples, but just a reminder, you can't just add these two together and get it. The data is in there, so you could filter those two databases yourself if you wanted to filter down to what now counts. But I'm just going to exit out of this for a second and see if I have the gap 1, 2, 3 in here. I don't think I have the longer definitions off of the 4, obviously, because they just get pretty nuanced. So maybe I'll go back with this.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, I can always go on the USGS page and dig it up. I have before, so that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, 2 and 3. So honestly, the hardest is deciding if you're 2 or 3. If you're 1 or 4, those are normally pretty obvious. A fair number of the 2s are straightforward. But when it comes to 2 or 3, it starts to become a mixed question of what is in the intent. Is there mixed use? How much of it is mixed use? If it's mixed use, which is the priority of the 2 if they conflict? So those are the types of questions that get asked. CNRI did have 2 fellows who were talking to different groups and came up with this, which I'll send in the slide deck that you all will have access to. And there's also a PDF where they talked through different groups. And these were some of the common things that they were finding as scenarios as they were going through. One key recent guidance, I guess would be the word, that came out of USGS is that if you're an accredited land trust and you have property that meet their standards, that counts. So if you have the management plan that qualifies you to be an accredited land trust, that qualifies as a management plan. So when that 3 questions of protection, management plan, and biodiversity, you would be able to check that management plan off by that. Because management plan is the hardest area. They don't want to dictate that you need a management plan that looks like this or has XYZ formula. It's being left more open, which is great because it allows for you not having to do extra paperwork or show or have some example of it, but it does leave this ambiguity of like, is my management plan enough? So if you're LTA accredited, I would say that's the easiest way to sort of check that box. It's not a requirement, but it is sort of an easy way to know for a lot of groups. So as I said, you don't add them together, you instead add the gap 1, gap 2, and that's where you come at 30 by 30. So where we're at right now is like 24 point. I think this is going to tick up closer to 25%. And an upcoming release, it's sort of stuck in the gears of the state of California, unfortunately. But I would say between 24 and 25% is where we're at. So we're looking at about 5% to finish off what needs to be protected to meet that goal by 30 by 30. I noted this earlier, but we'll come back to this problem, which is the fact that CPAD and CCED are pretty robust in terms of having the lands represented in the databases. But what we need more help on is making sure that the gap codes are correct. We do have default assignments, but you have complete authority to overwrite those. If you see a code that you don't like, all you have to do is let us know, and we will change that. It's also known that this is a difficult system to define because it's not rigid. So you can also change your mind. If you determine, say you assign your land is a gap 3 for one particular park. If you decide the next month, oh, actually, no, we do qualify as a 2, you just let me know and I update that. It doesn't become an extra hurdle to change a value that you've put in there. We have lots of different ways you can work with us to update those, and we can walk through those slides if that's of interest. But if people instead have topic or other conversations that we want to have, because we haven't gotten towards the freshwater element, I want to just pause there and see which direction folks want to steer the discussion at this point. And you can put a vote in chat if you want to just see how to contribute data or how that whole process works, or if you want to have a side conversation about more nuanced types of protected lands. And if nobody says anything, I'll just keep going.
Do you have a recommendation based on previous webinars that you've given? I'm at least it seems to me that maybe the technical know-how about how to contribute could come at the end.
Yeah, I think I would inform sort of what might most be useful based on 2 things. One is if you're at an agency that has protected properties that you think needs to update their gap codes, like you're not sure, you don't know if anybody's looked at it, if they're right, et cetera, and you think you can actually make that contribution, versus if you're just going to be telling someone else, such as a GIS person or somebody else on your staff saying, hey, go look at 30 by 30, I need you to do the legwork of the data, but I need to understand the concept, then we probably want to come back more towards, because freshwater is not specifically called out in 30 by 30. We're just doing allocated terrestrial acreage, which is, I think, the more nuanced conversation that might be of value for this smaller subgroup, but it certainly would need to be conversation, because I'm not going to have answers, but instead ideas or thoughts that we might go through. And we have a raised hand somewhere. Sorry, I'm on 3 screens and I just see a hand raised.
Yeah, it's Andre.
Andre.
Hey, Sam. Hello. Yeah. So my question is, has there been any consideration of doing, I guess you could say, similar GIS exercise with any of the freshwater bodies within California? So that being, for example, and I know it can get into a quick wormhole, or a black hole of, what size water body would we be talking about in terms of like a lake or a wetland area. But obviously the most obvious ones are doing streams. So particularly, for example, things that would qualify under gap 1 is wild and scenic rivers, under the federal act or the state act, or inversely, I guess you could even say, develop reservoirs and I don't know how these definitions would apply, but long story short, has there been any consideration of trying to do this with freshwater bodies or wetlands for that matter?
Yeah, so I will say, my sense is that the state's pretty overwhelmed with just terrestrial. And what we try, CPAD itself actually does try to integrate within a property if it's land versus water. So if there are major water bodies, we try to allocate those a little bit differently and note that. But as you said, the first question is like, what's your threshold? Does it need to be covered in water? Does it need to be all year? How big of a lake, stream, et cetera, does it need to be? So I think in terms of formality of the state adding a freshwater criteria that's tracked, I don't see that happening, at least in the next year or so. I do think it's something where the group of folks that are interested in freshwater would then have the ability on their own to say, okay, these are the ways we want to track it. We want to look at wild and scenic river. We want to include X, Y, or Z. So I think it would give the group some freedom to say, here's what we see as protected as freshwater, and here's what we want our goals to be. But I mean, the state is still struggling on the marine side also. So there's some sort of similarities within that. And I think the main difference is that CPAD and CCED had existed already for so long with this sort of tangible boundary of property ownership that allowed them to leverage here, which we don't have in either the marine or the freshwater environment.
Thank you.
We did meet with Cal Trout and I believe another group or two it's probably been 6 months at least ago now, just sort of discussing these issues. There haven't been clear answers that have come for that or any clear direction from the state either. So it is an area that I think folks on the freshwater side will have to champion a bit more if they want more tangible numbers being represented with 30 by 30.
Thank you for that info. That answers some of the questions I came in here with. If there are no more questions, do you mind seeing through the end of your presentation?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we do have a number of ways, and I will say if none of these work, you're always fine to just call us or email us and we'll help walk you through it. The problem is really that we're just not going to be able to know everything that you folks know about your own properties. And so the best thing is to get the information from you somehow over to us, and we're pretty flexible about how we make that happen. We have a number of different ways, and I'll walk through them now and show you. So we're asking that you, first of all, just look, does CPAD and CCD have your property in it, and does it look accurate? You can view that online. You can request maps from us. We have a toolkit where you can download. So we have a number of options of how you can view that property. The second one is the biggest ask, which is understand gap codes. And I don't think anybody fully understands them, including USGS themselves, because they were developed, like I said, nationally, and now we're applying them state and locally. But understanding the nuance and where the gray areas are is key. Then from there, looking and assigning what you feel is the best gap codes for your property and sending them back to us. So these are sort of the objectives or steps that we're looking for folks to go through. So I'll walk through and give you more tangible how to do each of these steps. So we have a full website developed here that has a lot of information. So what is 30 by 30? Information out of USGS, the individual gap code definitions, examples that we know have been given clear answers, etc. And the main thing to start here is if you want to look, so in this case, we're looking at Solano Land Trust, you can enter any agency name, so your own or someone else's, and download the most current data that we have for your agency or organization. And when you download that information, we'll walk through different ways you can view that and get it back to us. And where, this is out of order, sorry. Okay, so you go here, which is this. So this is the actual live toolkit. So we'll do Trout Unlimited since they're all here. Well, maybe we don't have, or I have a typo. Gonna look that up. Okay, we'll do this one for now. So you would download this, it'll give you a zip file, and then I'll show you what's contained in that zip file. If you wanted the full state, you could just go down and get the whole CPAD CCED. But this is that's going to be the entire state. And if you're just looking at one small section, this will be much harder. Once you download that, you're going to get different options to review it. The main two methods are to look at your information in an Excel table. So this is meant to be for someone who doesn't have mapping capacity, or you just don't want to deal with it in that way. And what it does is it downloads a table for you that lists all of the properties assigned to your organization. It'll give you the name that we have for it, the acreage, if the public can access it or not, and then there'll be an area where you can interact with the gap code. Now, obviously, you might want to see some of these, so there's also a link to an online map. So you could go look at a map in a web browser that will link and show you that. If you're familiar and want to use GIS, we have shape files that you can download. So you can look at those in QGIS, ArcMap, ArcPro, etc. We could also send you KMLs for Google Earth files if you need. And when you download it, if you were looking at it as a shapefile in GIS, you'll see that we have the individual parcels like I noted before, and then the whole comprised property around that. So for each individual one, a quick question that comes up is, what if this whole property comes up? Do I have to assign it one gap code? No, you can actually assign every individual parcel all 4 gap codes. What you do is you tell us the amount of acreage. So if you want to make it easy on yourself and you think you can generally lump your whole park, you could say this whole thing is gap 2 and I'm done. Or you could say this is, I want to go through each individual parcel and tell you this is half gap 2, half gap 3, this is all gap 4, this is gap 3, and then I will compile that and read it all and bring it all back to you. So you have complete flexibility to be as nuanced or as overarching as you need to give that submission. Does that make sense? I know it's a common question for folks to say, do I have to give every park one gap code? And no, the answer is you can give it multiple if you want, if that's most appropriate. If you were to open the table that I mentioned, this would be where I was saying you'll have the name, level of access, the size. In this case, I have the Nature Conservancy selected, and you can see that they can enter the gap code. This would be where you would click on the link, and that would pull up that map for you online to be able to view that property. So if you're just working in Excel on a table, this would be how you would see that and interact. You could fill in the gap codes, you can give us any notes, and then you could just send us back that Excel table. And because we have it standardized in this way with unique ID save, what we can do is then just join your information back in to ours and pull your gap codes in. If there was something existing, we will overwrite that. Or if they're new, those will come in. And so if you're looking at in GIS, again, these are similar, but you'll see the fields that are listed for you. And then these are where you're allowed to submit edits and information. So if you're in GIS and you wanted to make a boundary change, you could do that and send that back to us. Like I said earlier on, we're pretty flexible. So one other thing is if you already have your own GIS data and you feel pretty good about it, you can just send me that and say, this is our GIS data. Can you please look and make sure that yours matches? And then we can do that. One thing we do find is it's best to make sure the geometry and the park core or property details are right, and then move to gap code assignment after that. Because oftentimes folks are saying, well, I want to give this parcel 50% this, 50% that gap code. And if your acreages are changing, it just becomes more confusing. So we find that getting this solid in GIS, represent your park or property, then assign gap codes is the most productive for folks. We do update our toolkits every week. So if you send me information, if I'm able to get to it in that following week or two, as soon as I've gone through and made the edits to your geometry and I feel like we've represented your changes, we then notify you by email saying, hey, you can go grab your new toolkit. It will reflect all the changes you've requested. If it looks good, you go with gap code assignment. If we need to make additional refinements, we do that. Other ways you could tell us would be if you want to add a property or make an adjustment and you happen to know your parcel numbers, you can just send me that. I have access to statewide parcels, and I can use that to identify your parks. I can also take existing maps that you might have reports from. Property descriptions can be worked from, but if you have a lot, we might not be able to get through those very quickly. So again, quite flexible. And really what I need is the information you have that I don't have. So I'm willing to take almost anything that you'll send me so that I can get there. And the other option is some people say, just send me a map of every property. So we can produce a PDF of every property we have for you in the 2 databases, send it over to you with parcels, and then you can tell us if it's right or not. So that's yet another option for that. So the key ask is that make sure that your agency, if you own and or manage properties, that you've reviewed your data and it looks right. And you've assigned gap codes. If you happen to know like neighbors or other agencies working around you, make sure that they're aware of 30 by 30 in this process going on. This group, I would say it would be another key one for if we want a smaller working group to discuss in more detail how we're going to deal with freshwater, what the options are given the limitations of the state, but what might, I think that allows a lot of flexibility for you as a group to define what you need or want out of this system. And then we can explore how we can integrate that with what we already have in the data or what might augment it. So it might be burning in wild and scenic rivers. It might be looking at, any number of other hydrological options of data that exist in GIS that we might use to quantify protection of those freshwaters. We're always happy to come talk and or present to a group, and then really like feedback on the data itself or how we're soliciting feedback is always welcome. So if you use the toolkit and you find it's not working for you, you can send us an email saying this is not working and why, and we'll try to fix that. We do have somebody who can also do interviews and things to help say, okay, what are the pain points in getting this done and how can we make that easier for you on our end? So the current sort of where we're at now is that we released 2024 A in June. So a recent update came out. Like I said, it comes out twice a year. The state is still processing essentially that map where I showed 24.4% should be updated. It will be any day, just going through the gears of the government and getting approval at some point for them to publish that new number. Hopefully before December, because in December, we will be putting out a new release of CPAD and CCED that'll update any new lands and properties that we've made and also add in any new gap codes that folks send over to us. Yep, and we're here. There are 3 to 4 of us on this side working as much as we can on this and happy to support webinars, one-on-one support, group meetings, etc. So I think that's the gist of what I had. Additional questions or discussion or anything?
Thanks so much, Amanda. That was a lot of information. That was awesome.
Yeah, sorry, I know it's a little bit of an overload, sort of.
Oh no,
throwing everything out there. So if something occurs to you in a day or a week, or you can't remember, or you have a question, I'm always here for that.
Great.
Yeah, really appreciate this, Amanda. Thanks. Is GreenInfo Network under contract to CNRA?
Correct.
For this? Okay. So can I ask you to riff a little bit on how, if at all, you think we can better measure areas of freshwater resource areas so that they qualify in terms of the state's monitoring of its progress toward 30 by 30. This has been a struggle for this group specifically, and I'm wondering if, in your experience, there's been any other metric for measuring other than acreage. For example, stream flow.
Yeah, so my take, and this is my take and not anything that the state would necessarily stand behind or not, but
yeah, no, I'm not asking you to speak for the state.
Yeah.
I think, they're where they are, but I'm just wondering if there's, what I'm getting at is if there are things that we haven't thought about yet here that we could be advocating for, that the state might consider.
Yes.
So,
Yeah,
anyway.
my impression is that the state would be open and welcome ideas, but they're already overwhelmed. And so if the group could come to them and say, we have a consensus, because they're about looking for a consensus and this being a ground up. So I think the advantage there is that if the group can say, we've decided XYZ is a meaningful criteria and a robust enough way, nothing is, fully, even this other system is not perfect. We think this is a representative and logical way, and we have pretty good agreement among the group that we want to track this and it's feasible. I think they would be open to that. What they don't have is the resource or the capacity to come up with yet another measure when they're still struggling on the first measure. So terrestrial is going pretty well already based on data, but it's still hard. And trying, I'm connecting with over 1,000 agencies trying to get this update going. But the marine is a whole other element. The tribal element is actually entirely somewhat separate out of the need for that to be tracked differently. A USGS gap code system doesn't really apply to a native lands protection, right? That's not logical. So to add on freshwater, I think is just too much for them. And so if the presentation to them comes with solution or close to solution, I think that's how you get them to adopt or focus in on it. I don't think you're going to get resistance from them. I think it's just a matter of them not being able to add one more thing to their list. So basically, if you can kind of do the thinking and the work for them, I think they're open to it.
Thank you. I'm not sure I share your assessment there, but I think in part just because water, there's so many interests pulling
That's
at
true.
it. And so a way that we have previously articulated to the resources agency would be to think about protection for water in terms of stream flow, which makes a lot of, which is a very scientific and kind of rationale way to do it. Part because flow is a key metric for biodiversity, typically. And anyway, what I'm getting at is mostly, I think, just trying to think of things that we haven't thought of yet. And because you can create a new wilderness area or national monument, but it may not actually protect freshwater resources and the biodiversity, which are, sort of the cornerstone of biodiversity.
Right.
And so anyway, trying to fill that gap, as it were.
Yeah, it's like it's the most important, but the hardest to also tangibly track. Although maybe I'm not nearly as well versed in the marine and hydro and all of that world. So I certainly default to you guys on those. It's interesting to hear that it's been proposed to them different ways they might do it, and the reaction was it sounds like might not have been too positive. Or
well, it was mostly just, I think, as you pointed out, there, just the whole initiative is kind of overwhelming, and so getting landowners or managers to provide timely report, sort of up-to-date reports on what would be considered, since it's a self-reporting system, essentially, the gap status data is, I think it's just asking them to do something that's not been done before, that they're not already doing, just seemed like a kind of too heavy a lift, I think.
Yeah, it's like their agenda feels really full as it is. So when someone comes forward saying, let's add a little bit more and let's think about this more, I think I get that sort of deer in the headlights response.
There are, just so you know, there was a bill, legislation introduced here in the state legislature that would have created sub-program in the kind of the State Water Resources Control Board that would have established sort of a test for measuring freshwater protection, and it would have required watershed management plans and drought preparation management plans for North Coast drainages. And it got vetoed by the governor. So and I think it was, I mean, he vetoed it on purely on a sort of a fiscal basis. That would have been a very, very modest sort of, you know, budget outlay required to staff this. But it was, if it were a priority for the administration, you know, it would have been done. But I think that like having those kinds of plans in place, that would be a mechanism for entities to be able to weigh in and say, if the plan calls for, you know, preserving freshwater sources in this and all the biodiversity that's dependent on them, both in situ and downstream, in times of, you know, drought or plenty, that maybe would qualify. Maybe that, I don't know how exactly we measure that. Maybe it's acreage in the, you know, in the flood, you know, the 100-year mean floodplain. Anyway, there would be ways to think about it if we had that plan, without necessarily having, you know, wilderness designation around it or something like that.
Yeah, because you're going back to the protection of the source, and it's, yeah, it takes what the strengths of CPAD tracking of terrestrial is, and it's sort of like the inverse of that. And so that's why I think people have struggled to come up with how you do that. I mean, by definition, it's always moving, right? It's water.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the discussion. I wish I had better solutions or answers. I'm happy to keep thinking about them, like solving hard problems. So
Yeah. No, you guys do great work. Thank you for this. We're maybe you can yeah. So Michelle, good question. You see the question in the chat from Michelle, who I'm working with closely on outstanding waters designation for the Medicine Lake Highlands specifically.
interesting.
Yeah.
And the Fall River Springs.
Yeah, and the Fall River Springs complex, exactly.
I had a narrower technical question.
Sure.
If I could. I was you used the Nature Conservancy as an illustration there. You know, obviously a great conservation landholder. They do a lot of work on. They have properties that have a lot of working lands and different degrees of agricultural intensity. It looks like their working lands, they've been essentially all into GAP 2. Given that that's self-reported, for other parties doing similar sort of work, are there any kind of criteria that we might be able to use to determine the degree of intensity of land management that would kick it from 2 to 3 or from 3 to 2?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion because working lands have been pretty critical, because 30 by 30 doesn't want to be, well, it is entirely focused on biodiversity, but it wants to acknowledge that there are other things that are going to need to happen, and things have to have co-use. So there have been a lot of discussions about sustainable uses and low intensity. So if done right, grazing would not be a problem. You can graze the entire property as long as it's done in the right ways that are meant to mimic or work with biodiversity. Forestry is another one that's been pretty clearly defined as okay, as long as done with the right intent behind it. So it starts to come back to what is the additional land use and how much can it overlap or not. So ag has been the one that is less likely to qualify. And that starts to become, is it intensive ag? Is it year round? So those are the questions that come about. So I would say generally ag is falling towards 3, forest, working forest, and rangelands are trending towards 2. Those are sort of the patterns that I'm seeing so far.
So that's helpful. So statin is an illustration that we like to use. So the north portions of the island are in tomatoes, which is about as intense as agriculture gets. They've been that as too. But the areas that are in, let's say, conservation grazing that are used by a multiplicity of avian species, that's also 2 for the same island. So do you have any guidance on how we might be able to look at that? Because we're looking specifically, we're supporting U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Bureau of Land Management in the same area. And we want to be able to provide additional conservation lands that would fit within the program, but we also have a significant working lands component. So that's why I'm trying to parse that out.
Yeah, so I think what you were saying was an example where you have a property that essentially is half intense ag and half grazing. In that case, I would say you could just tell me that property and say it's 50% probably gap 3 or 4 for
Right.
the intense and gap 2 for the other. And that's all. I don't need to know where on the property it is. If you happen to know it and you want to send it, that's fine. But we already know this is a big ask. So you can just give us percentage. Anything within 5% is sort of a rounding error as we start to work up the system. If you have more refined, I'm happy to take it. If you think you're within 5%, I would say you're okay to check that box if you're comfortable and move on.
That's great. Super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
In regards to Sam's question, we have ONRW, Wild and Scenic. The state has those files. No one needs to generate those. Is it really just a matter of a joint effort consensus letter identifying that we've reached out to our peers? There's multiple levels at CNRA, and we don't want to step on anybody's toes. And this, frankly, to me, feels as much like an academic issue as much as a technical resource issue.
Yeah, I will say they do account for Wild and Scenic River right now, but I think there's been negotiation as to if that's done properly or refined enough. So I think that would be your first in, is like, if you can just say, hey, we think you should improve Wild and Scenic, you should
Right.
use this, you should use those criteria. I think that could, I would hope potentially even in the December release, they'd be able to incorporate that update. I don't know as much or really much at all about the ONRW and how those are tracked or how that might play out. But I do think they're definitely open to the facts, such as, so we do with the data that goes into the system, and then they do bring on top of that Wild and Scenic Rivers. So if there were another layer that should come in after the fact, some sort of designation or other thing that may not entirely aligned to ownership, that is not a disqualifying thing. So, if there are ways to do that after, I think you could entertain those also with them.
Do you have a recommendation as to which level of staff that we could maybe have a conversation about Wild and Scenic and making sure that that's consistent with our understanding?
So the person who's going to do the data work on their end is going to be Cole Dickerson, I believe. He's a newer on their side. He just did the last GIS post release. And then the next step up would be Madeline, and she'll be the one that could help. So Cole would do the spatial work of making the data change that happens. And then I think Madeline would be the one to go to figure out if it can get approved or officially added.
Great. Thank you.
And you're happy to include or not include me on any of those communications. If you think it'll help or not help, you can leave me in or out. And then, the other thing that does come to mind is that Megan, even higher up the chain, has been really responsive to ideas that have tangible ways to be approached. So if you as a group feel like you've come to pretty clear consensus on something and you want to push forward, I wouldn't shy too much away from going actually directly to Megan. Now that she's onboarded, I think she is now fully up to speed and has been receptive, whereas Jen was just trying to get things going. So I think we are at the sweet spot where you might get engagement at that level. So I wouldn't say don't do it. Just make sure you feel prepared when you get there.
Right.
Thank you. I have one more question. I know we're 5 till, so I'll respect that, but I wanted to like gauge you and also others here. If you have any idea as to how the Klamath River might be counted towards 30 by 30 or protected further.
I don't offhand
Mhm.
know what things are. I can certainly look into who, it really comes back to who are the land managers in that
Yeah.
area,
Mhm.
and making sure that they're engaged and reporting.
All right. Well, we have a lot to think about and brainstorm, it looks like. So thank you everybody for coming here and, you know, putting our brains together for this. Yeah, any last questions for Amanda? Oh.
No, just thanks again, Amanda. Really appreciate the time. Great work. And I hope we'll come up with yet more creative ways to take advantage of all of this.
Yeah, happy to meet with you all. Hopefully, I also like improved data. I like tracking. I like things that I like these types of systems. So feel free to either reach out to me directly or to the broader email that I put earlier. I'll send the slide deck over to you, Josefina, that you can share with anybody out there. But yes, keep me
Fantastic.
informed and invite me back if you think there's anything I can do to help, or just listen in. Happy to do that.
Great, thank you so much.
And Josefina, thank you for putting this together. Much appreciated.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.
All right. Thanks, guys.